Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today we're exploring the fascinating world of mental imagery.
That's right. We're talking about the mind's eye and how we create these sensory experiences even without any external input.
Yeah, think of it like your brain's own personal VR studio.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on mental imagery as our guide.
It's going to be a great roadmap, I think, for all of us to really understand what mental imagery is all about.
And especially for you as a philosopher, this should be particularly insightful.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many questions we're going to be tackling, right? Like, how is mental imagery different from imagination?
Right. And how does it shape how we actually perceive the world?
Yeah.
And could it even hold some clues to the very nature of consciousness itself?
Ooh, big question.
Big question.
So let's start with the basics. What exactly do we mean when we say mental imagery?
Well, from a scientific perspective, mental imagery is essentially perceptual representation without it being triggered by actual sensory input.
Okay, so it's not just about like picturing things in your mind.
Right. It can be any of our senses. It can be visual, auditory, olfactory, tactile, gustatory,
So it's the whole package.
the whole sensory package, but all happening inside your head.
Okay, so it's more than just seeing things in your mind's eye. It's like having your own personal holodeck.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting because then how is a mental image like picturing your childhood home different from the broader concept of mental imagery?
Yeah, are they not the same thing?
So a mental image is like one snapshot, one product of mental imagery, right? So that picture of your childhood home is like one scene in your mental VR studio. But mental imagery is the whole process, the studio itself.
Got it. So if mental imagery is the studio, then a flashback to a scary movie would be like one of those horror scenes playing in your head, even though you're not actually watching the movie anymore?
A perfect analogy, and that actually brings us to another important point. Not all mental imagery is conscious.
Ooh, that's kind of spooky.
Yeah, you might have these processes happening below the surface,
Without me even realizing.
influencing your thoughts and behaviors.
So my brain is creating these experiences without my permission.
In a way, yes, and it really highlights the complexity of mental imagery and, the fact that we have to look beyond just what people can report experiencing.
Okay, so let's clear up another common misconception. How is mental imagery different from imagination? I feel like a lot of people use those terms interchangeably.
They are related for sure, but there is a key distinction. Imagination is more about generating ideas and creating new possibilities, often through a deliberate act of will.
Okay,
Mental imagery can be involuntary, like those intrusive thoughts or flashbacks we talked about.
so those earworms, I get those annoying songs stuck in my head. That's auditory mental imagery, not me deliberately choosing to imagine that music.
Precisely. And this question of can we have imagination without mental imagery is a question philosophers have been debating for centuries.
Yeah, and I feel like even just trying to define mental imagery, we're already kind of going down these philosophical rabbit holes.
Absolutely. And I think this is where the philosophical perspective becomes so valuable because how we define and understand mental imagery can have huge implications for how we view perception, knowledge, consciousness, and even, the nature of reality itself.
Okay, so we've kind of explored what mental imagery is, but what does it actually do? What role does it play in our mental lives?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting because mental imagery isn't just this passive phenomenon. It actively shapes how we perceive the world, remember the past experience, emotions, make decisions, and even engage with art.
Wow. Okay, so we've got a lot to unpack here.
We do.
So let's start with perception. I know I often see images in my head when I'm trying to remember what something looks like. Is that mental imagery at work?
Absolutely. And it highlights how mental imagery represents the world around us, just like perception does.
Okay.
They both allow us to attribute qualities and relationships to things,
Uh-huh.
and both are influenced by our attention. When you really focus on something, you can pick up more details both in real life and in your mind's eye.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, if I'm picturing a beach in my mind, the more I focus on it, the more details I can see, like the waves, the sand, even the smell of the salty air. But how is that different from actually being on a beach? Isn't real perception a lot more vivid?
That's a common assumption, and it's a point of contention in philosophy as well.
Okay.
Some argue that mental imagery is just this weak imitation of true perception, but recent research suggests that it's not that simple. Sometimes our mental images can be even more detailed and specific than our perceptions.
Really, how is that possible?
Well, think about it. Perception is constantly bombarded with new information from our senses, so our brains have to filter and prioritize, meaning we're not always consciously aware of every single detail. But with mental imagery, we have more control. We can zoom in on specific aspects and make them even more distinct than they might be in real life.
Interesting. So mental imagery can be surprisingly detailed, but can it actually shape how we perceive the world? That seems like a pretty bold claim.
It is, and it's something philosophers have debated for centuries. Remember Kant's idea that mental imagery is a necessary ingredient of perception itself?
Yep.
Well, modern research may be proving him right. Take a modal completion, for example. Have you ever seen a cat hiding behind a picket fence?
Yeah, of course. You just see bits and pieces of the cat, but your brain kind of fills in the missing parts, so you perceive a whole cat, even though you can't see the whole thing.
Exactly. Your brain is creating a representation of the cat's entire body, even though you're only getting visual input for parts of it. And that, my friend, is a form of mental imagery.
Wait, I thought a modal completion was a perceptual thing, not an imagery thing.
It's both. Remember, our definition, mental imagery, is perceptual representation that isn't directly triggered by sensory input.
Right.
In the case of the cat, the input from your eyes is only about the fence.
Oh.
But your brain is using mental imagery to go beyond that input and construct a complete picture of the cat.
Okay, so our brains are constantly using mental imagery to fill in these gaps and make sense of the world around us.
Yes, and it happens in more than just vision, too. Think about listening to a song with a familiar voice.
Okay.
Even if the music is muted, your brain might automatically hear the singer's voice in your head.
Yeah, that happens to me all the time.
That's another example of mental imagery at work. This one is called multimodal mental imagery because one sense, in this case sight, triggers an experience, in another sense, hearing.
So that's why watching like a dramatic movie with the sound off can still be so emotionally engaging. Our brains are filling in the auditory experience with mental imagery.
So cool, but let's get back to modal completion. Are you saying that this mental imagery process is actually part of how we perceive the world?
it seems to be a key ingredient, yes. Think about it, most of the objects we encounter in the world are partially hidden by something else.
So our visual systems constantly rely on a modal completion to create this cohesive picture of what we're seeing.
This is making me rethink everything I thought I knew about perception. It's like there's this whole hidden world of mental imagery running in the background, shaping our experience without us even realizing it.
Exactly. And this connection between perception and mental imagery goes even deeper. There's actually evidence suggesting that blind people, even those blind from birth, can experience visual mental imagery.
Wait, really? But how could they see things in their mind's eye if they've never had any visual input?
Well, it all comes down to the amazing plasticity of the brain. Their visual cortex, the part of the brain that processes sight, can still be active even without input from the eyes. And that activity can be triggered by other senses, like hearing or touch.
So a blind person listening to a description of a sunset could actually experience something like a visual image of that sunset in their mind.
That's the idea. It's another example of that multimodal mental imagery we were talking about, and it really highlights how interconnected our senses truly are.
Wow. Okay, so we've seen how mental imagery is a key player in perception, but what about its role in our thinking and actions?
That's where things get really fascinating, especially for philosophers. Mental imagery is deeply connected to how we remember things, experience emotions, and even make decisions. And it even plays a role in abstract thought.
So let's dive into that then. How does mental imagery play a role in our thinking and action?
Okay, well, let's start with memory. I know you mentioned earlier that you often see images in your head when you're trying to remember a past event.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, that's a great example of how mental imagery plays a major role in what we call episodic memory, our memory for personal experiences.
Okay.
So when you recall a birthday party from your childhood, for example,
Yeah.
you're likely using mental imagery to recreate the sights, the sounds, even the smells of that event.
Yeah, and it feels like the more vivid those mental images are, the more real the memory feels.
Exactly. It's as if our brains are reliving those experiences through mental imagery. And neuroscience research actually shows that when we recall these kinds of memories, the sensory areas of the brain that were active during the original experience, they actually reactivate.
So it's not just our imagination, it's like our brains are actually replaying those sensory experiences.
Right. And this has led some philosophers to argue that true episodic memory requires more than just mental imagery.
Okay.
They say there needs to be this direct causal connection to the past event, not just a mental recreation of it.
That's getting pretty deep.
It is a pretty deep philosophical question about, the nature of memory and personal identity.
Definitely. So mental imagery helps us remember the past, but how does it connect to our emotions?
Well, the connection is actually really profound. Remember how we talked about mental imagery being able to evoke strong emotional responses?
Yeah.
Well, it goes both ways. Our emotions also influence the types of mental images we create.
Oh, interesting.
So when we're feeling happy, we're more likely to conjure up pleasant images. But when we're anxious or stressed, those images tend to be more negative.
So it's like this feedback loop. Our emotions shape our mental imagery, and then that imagery further intensifies those emotions.
Exactly. And this has big implications for things like therapy and emotional well-being.
How so?
Well, therapists often use mental imagery techniques to help patients work through things like phobias, anxiety, even trauma.
Oh, wow.
The idea is that if you can learn to control your mental imagery, you can actually gain more control over your emotional responses as well.
That makes a lot of sense. So switching gears a bit, I've always wondered, can mental imagery help us generate new knowledge? Or is it just a way of rearranging information we've already experienced?
That is a question that has intrigued philosophers for ages.
Right.
Some philosophers, like Sartre, for example, argued that mental imagery can't teach us anything truly new. It's simply a tool for manipulating existing information.
Okay.
But others disagree. They point to examples where mental imagery seems to lead to genuine insights and discoveries.
Like what?
Well, imagine you're trying to figure out how to wrap a present. You might mentally visualize the box, and then realize you need more wrapping paper than you initially thought.
Yeah.
That realization about the size and shape of the paper could be seen as new information gained through mental imagery alone.
That's a good example. It's like your brain is running a virtual experiment
Exactly.
using mental imagery to test out different possibilities and then uncover new relationship.
It's almost like mental imagery can be a form of reasoning,
Yeah.
allowing us to make inferences and draw new conclusions. And for you as a philosopher, this raises all sorts of fascinating questions about the nature of knowledge and the role mental imagery might play in generating new understandings.
My mind is spinning. Okay, so we've covered perception, memory, emotions, even knowledge. What about mental imagery's influence on our actions and the decisions we make?
Well, this is where things get really interesting again. Remember how we talked about those routine actions we do almost automatically, like making coffee, brushing our teeth? Often that autopilot is being guided by mental imagery. It's called pragmatic mental imagery, and it allows us to do things without needing constant conscious attention.
So when I reach for my coffee mug in the morning, even before I fully open my eyes, my brain is using a mental image of the mug's location to guide my hand.
Exactly. It's like we have this internal map guiding our movements, especially for things we do habitually.
Wow. So even our most mundane actions can be shaped by mental imagery. That's wild. What about our desires and motivations? Do they play a role?
Absolutely. There's actually a theory called the elaborated intrusion theory, which proposes that mental imagery is a central part of desire.
Really, I always thought of desires as being more about feelings and thoughts, not images.
Well, think about it this way. Desires might start with a thought like chocolate would be nice, but then your brain starts generating these vivid mental images of that chocolate.
Uh-huh.
Its rich color, its smooth texture, the way it melts in your mouth, and suddenly the craving becomes much stronger.
Okay, now I'm getting hungry. I see your point, though. Those sensory details, those mental images, they really amplify the craving. It's almost like our brains are giving us this preview of the experience, making it even more tempting.
Exactly, and that's precisely why advertisers use mental imagery so effectively. They want to evoke those desires by getting us to vividly imagine the experience of using their product.
It makes me wonder if we can control our desires by controlling our mental imagery. Like if someone's trying to quit smoking, could they use techniques to replace those alluring images of cigarettes with something less appealing?
It's a fascinating possibility, and there is some evidence to support it. It's like learning to rewrite the script in our mental VR studios, replacing those unwanted scenes with something more helpful.
This whole deep dive has been mind-blowing. We've covered so much from the basic definition of mental imagery to its implications for perception, consciousness, art, and even personal growth.
And we've only scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore, especially from a philosophical perspective.
I couldn't agree more. If you're as fascinated by this topic as we are, we highly recommend checking out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on mental imagery.
It's a treasure trove of insights and thought-provoking ideas.
And don't forget to pay attention to your own mental imagery. Notice those images that pop into your head throughout the day. You might be surprised at what you discover about yourself and the world around you.
Great advice.
Thanks for joining me on this incredible journey into the world of mental imagery. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those mental images flowing.